The best of downtown from 7 to 8 a.m. on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket and 92.9theticket.com. This is the best of downtown.
Hey, good Sunday morning on this Columbus Day weekend. Rich Kimball, Brian Stackpole with you on the best of downtown 92.9 The Ticket, 92.9theticket.com, all around the state of Maine, around the world as well. Revisiting some of our favorite conversations from the past week, we'll hear from Steve Buckley of the Boston Herald, Gary Thorne, voice of the Baltimore Orioles, Prescott Rossi helps us preview Pat's game with the Bills today, plus Pete Grathoff of the Kansas City Star, Major League Baseball talk, and some Bruins insight from Joe Haggerty of Comcast Sportsnet New England, covering a lot of ground on this early Sunday morning. We kick things off a conversation from early in the week with the Boston Herald's Steve Buckley. We talked a lot of subjects, including beginning our conversation with some New England Patriots talk, asking him which Pat's team is for real, the one that got walloped by the Kansas City Chiefs or the one that put a shellacking on the Bengals last Sunday.
Well, not to stupid cliche, I actually just did a column for the Morris Herald, and in that column, one of the lines I had was, they're not as bad as they showed against Kansas City, and they're probably not as good as they showed against Cincinnati, and I kind of play it that way. I mean, everything went horribly wrong in the Kansas City game. In the Cincinnati game, the only reason I admire them for showing passion and aggressiveness and smarts and figuring out what was wrong. My only concern is that the game was terribly officiated, number one, and number two, as bad as New England played against Kansas City in the previous game, Cincinnati was even worse in its game against the Patriots. So I could pick like 4 or 5 junctures, missed passes by Dalton, missed passes by receivers, and also just mistakes from the line, not coverage mistakes, that helped New England win this game. So I'm not detracting from it. I'm just being measured in my enthusiasm.
How much of the offensive showing by the Patriots was an improved game plan, actually establishing a running game, and how much of this was guys rallying around their quarterback?
I think it's a little bit of both. I mean, clearly if you caught the post-game interviews and so forth, there was a lot of rallying around Tom Brady, particularly by Gronkowski. And there was a lot of like, nah, hey, you guys are wrong, and and so forth. And if you're watching him on TV, Al Michaels and Chris Collinsworth more or less said the same thing, which I find kind of hypocritical because they opened the pregame show by playing, showing 2 or 3 different covers of the Boston Herald, showing the sound bites from Belichick and his stupid press conference with his son at Cincinnati. They picked right up on that theme. What's wrong with Tom Brady in their pregame show. And then in the fourth quarter, when the Patriots were comfortably ahead, Al Michaels and Chris Collinsworth were saying, oh, can you believe these people thought the Patriots were dead? Ha, 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 like that. So I thought that was a little silly.
So what are the lingering concerns about this team going forward?
Lingering concerns. Lingering concern would be, is the offensive line as good as it showed against Cincinnati last night? Is that still a work in progress? Does Tom Brady have the targets he needs to succeed? Is Tom Brady still Tom Brady, or is he aged? Again, you go back to what I said a few minutes ago, they're not as bad as they showed against Kansas City, but not as good as they showed against Cincinnati. Therefore, you need to be measured in how you look at things moving forward. It looks like they're going to be 6-2 in short order because they got Buffalo and the Jets coming up, and they got another weak team after that, but they could be 6-2 before you know it.
When Robert Kraft hears the criticisms
Chicago
of
Bears.
When Kraft hears, I'm sorry, I was going to say,
go ahead.
When Robert Kraft hears the criticisms of Bill Belichick, the general manager, not so much the coach, does any of that stick with him? Does he look at that situation and say, boy, we haven't really done a great job personnel-wise over the last few years?
I think he's aware. I don't think that Robert Kraft and Bill Belichick are fishing buddies. I think they have a very productive business relationship. And as long as he continues to win, and God knows he's done nothing but win since 2001, granted they haven't won a Super Bowl since way back in the day, but they keep going for anywhere from 12 to 14 wins just about every year. And you can look at recent drafts and wonder what was going on. You can look at the second-round pick that was expended on Garoppolo and say, okay, maybe Garoppolo is a great pick for 2 or 3 years down the road. But if you, and again, I'm trying to think as Kraft might think, that if you do believe that the Tom Brady window is closing and that it's getting to the point now where there aren't future seasons left, then should you not have pushed the chips in the middle of the table right now and built for the season, in which case you would damn the torpedoes with the second-round pick, not think so much about the future and draft a player who could have helped you right now. Unless Brady gets hurt and misses the rest of the season, there's no way Garoppolo can help you right now. And then there's the Mankins trade, which is mandated by ownership. That isn't a football decision so much as an ownership decision. You could certainly argue that losing Mankins hurts them right now, may help them in the future, but I don't think it helps them right now.
We're talking with Steve Buckley of the Boston Herald. Steve, on his way to remember a former colleague of mine and a guy much beloved all over the state of Maine, but certainly in Portland, Bruce Glazier, WCSH longtime sportscaster. Bruce, you met him back in the day when you were working for the Portland Press-Herald. He was, the phrase is overused, but Bruce Glazier was certainly one of a kind, if anybody was.
He certainly was. He, as you know, worked at the Press-Herald before I got there. And he had already, when I moved to Maine in '79, he had already moved on to Channel 6 in Portland. And he was an established broadcaster when I got to Maine. And I got to know him at Maine Mariners games and UMaine football games and the various banquets and stuff that we go to. And we had an instant rapport. I think when I really got to know Bruce very, very well was the first spring training of the Maine Guides in Tucson, Arizona in 1984. I was going to Arizona to cover the original Maine Guides team at the Cleveland Indians spring training site as a staff writer for the Portland Press-Herald. He was there for a couple of weeks representing Channel 6, which was going to carry some games that year. And we went out to dinner every night. We palled around at the High Corbett Field, which was the Indians training site in those days. And it's just like he just busted a gut on me every single night. He was so funny. And just the bombast he brought. We just had more fun at dinners. Bruce and me, Doc Edwards, who was going to be the manager of the Maine Guys, Gary Thorne from Old Town, who was the I think he's from Old Town, Orono, but you obviously know him from the PA at Maine Black Bears games and the hockey team and so forth. But he was the original announcer, and Jordan Colberts, and we were going out every night. It was so much fun, and that's how Bruce and I became friends. And he also gave me my start in TV because he was doing a show called Sports Overtime on Channel 6 on Sunday nights. And I'd say like once a month he would have me on as co-host. And I still have some of the VHS tapes at home that are very funny. And but that's how I got my start in television.
Well, and Bruce, no one was spared from Bruce's barbs. He went after everybody equally, but all that hid, too. A guy who was certainly gruff on the outside, but was a lovable guy who had a great passion for sports and the people who love sports.
He did, and he also was one of the earlier people to understand that it was more than just giving scores and highlights and so forth. He did bring an entertainment measure to what he did. He did video spoofs on things. You remember the Mean Joe Green Coca-Cola commercial? He did a spoof on that I think involved his own son, Paul Glazier, who I'll be seeing because I'm going to Bruce. I'm actually in Maine right now, somewhere just south of Bitterford, and I'm on my way to South Portland. But he did a takeoff, a spoof on the Mean Joe Green commercial, which I believe won some major award for sportscasting excellence. I forget exactly what the award was, but he used to do those quite often, and they were always very funny.
And that was Steve Buckley of the Boston Herald talking about the New England Patriots' victory against the Cincinnati Bengals last Sunday night, and also some thoughts on Bruce Glazier from last Monday on Downtown with Rich Kimball. You're listening to the Best of Downtown for this 12th day of October 2014. Still a lot more football talk to come, as we'll talk with Prescott Rossi of WROC in Rochester to give us the Buffalo Bills perspective, and much more as we progress through this program. But we'll take our first break. On the other side, we'll hear from Gary Thorne, the Orioles broadcaster, who will also be doing some coverage for MLB International. We'll talk to him about, again, the ALCS, which got underway on Friday night, and also just the playoffs in general on how the Orioles got to this point. We'll talk with Gary after the break here on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket.
A previously recorded Best of Downtown, your Sunday morning. Rich Kimball and Brian Stackpole here. Major League Baseball League Championship Series rolling along. In the American League, the Royals and the Baltimore Orioles going head-to-head. Old Town native Gary Thorne, of course, the voice of the Orioles, but also broadcasting the ALCS and the World Series for Major League Baseball International TV. That's the worldwide broadcast. We talked with Gary on Thursday about the great run this season for his Orioles.
Yeah, no question. It was great fun. If you love baseball, having a chance to watch this team play all year was exceptional because, they really play the game well. They're a solid defensive ball club. The guys have a really good group of players. They have a great time playing the game. They grind it out the way you're supposed to. And they're fun to be around. They're nice people. I think that's the highest compliment you can pay to them. They're the kind of people you'd want to be around, whether they were ball players or your next-door neighbor doing something else. So it was great. It was really fun to watch them go for it and to pick it up. On the 1st of July, they put the pedal down and never stopped.
People will say, well, this team doesn't have a legitimate number one starter, but Chris Tillman sure pitched awfully well, especially in the second half of the year. And while maybe there isn't a number one, there are a lot of guys who go out there and get the job done.
Yeah, well, that's the big thing about this. It is kind of a no-name team. We were talking about that this morning. If you ask people who are not Oriole fans, just around baseball, who's the face of the Orioles? I think the easy answer to that, and there's really only one, is the manager. Buck Showalter is the most known quantity in the general populace sense. Adam Jones would probably be the most recognizable player, but other than that, there's not a lot known around the baseball world about the Orioles outside of the fans who follow the team. And the pitching has been just that. It's been superb, though. The Orioles starters ranked third in ERA in the league. As starters coming in, finishing out the season. So, they've been very good, and the bullpen's even better. But again, it's a group that people aren't familiar with, and that's kind of why everyone looks a little jaundiced, I think, at the Orioles, wondering how they got there. How'd you do that with a group of players who are really no-name players at this point?
Boy, one of the guys who should be getting a lot of credit but is under the radar is a guy that the Red Sox fans know well from his time there, Dave Wallace, who was brought in and really has done some terrific work with this young pitching staff of finding a closer in Zach Britton and really turning some of these young guys into top-line players.
Yeah, well, Zach, with Dave, Buck Showalter wanted Dave in the worst way, and there was some question whether or not Dave wanted to do this again. He's had some health problems, not now, but in previous couple of years. It's pretty serious, and whether or not he wanted to come back into baseball, and Buck he really was adamant about bringing him here. And Dave kind of epitomizes the way the Orioles go about their business. He doesn't like publicity. He doesn't do a lot of interviews. He stays hidden. He's away from the camera. He doesn't want attention. When you do get to talk to him, he gives credit to somebody else. That's the way he is, and that's kind of the way the Orioles are. But he's been phenomenal. Buck has made the biggest difference in the organization without question since he came on as manager. He changed the whole mentality of baseball in Baltimore with both fans and players. But Dave Wallace did it with the pitchers. And this isn't rocket science here. It's about first ball strikes. It's about attacking with the fastball in the strike zone. It's about developing an off-speed pitch, be it the changeup, slider, curveball, splitter, whatever you got. So you got something that looks a little different, and be willing to throw it for strikes and trust yourself. Well, it's hard to believe, but even at this level, there are a lot of pitchers who just won't do that. They don't have the confidence in it. They don't have the confidence in themselves, and maybe don't have the confidence in the people saying those things to them. But Dave was one of those guys. He got through to them, and it took spring training, and it took the first month and a half of the season before it happened, because they weren't very good, the starters, at the beginning of the season. But once they started doing what he asked them to do, the whole thing turned around.
Well, and how much credit should go as well to Dan Duquette for assembling this group?
A lot. He and Buck have a good relationship, so there's always a discussion that goes on. Dan does make the final decisions on these things. But again, I think what happened is that they're both on the same page about it's not just a talent, it's a person. They're looking for people who fit the organization, who fit in with the guys who are already here. And part of that is the mentality I was talking about the team first thing. And I know fans hear that all the time and probably don't believe it, but it matters. And if you go to ball clubs where you've got a big superstar who wants attention, demands to be put number one in every situation, you got problems. And the Orioles don't have that. I mean, it's about winning, period. And you've got to be willing to accept that, become part of it, do what needs to be done to win in a given situation. Then you fit. If you don't want to do that, you don't stay.
We're talking Major League Baseball playoffs with Gary Thorne here on Downtown, that team-first approach. How much of that went into the decision to not bring back Chris Davis for this series, despite the fact that his suspension will end in 5 games?
Well, that I think was pretty easy. You just can't go that long into a playoff series, best of 7, on a short bench. You need all 25 ready to go that gives you the best chance to win. The Orioles had decided, to put him on the roster. They don't have him available for those games here to start the ALCS. You just can't do that. And I don't, as much as they might have wanted that bat back in the lineup, that's just too big a risk.
So size up this series, first of all, from a managerial standpoint. Could you have a bigger contrast than Buck Showalter and Ned Yost?
No, I don't think so. And part of that is because you got the big contrast in the teams, the way the game is played. They both do have one thing in common, though. They both are very player-oriented. You will rarely, if ever, hear publicly anything said by either manager negative about the player. And both of them kind of open the gates for players to play the game the way they feel they should at that given moment and that given time. They don't want their players to be hesitant. They don't want their players to second-guess. You'll hear it from them all the time. I mean, Buck says, you're up there 3-0, and we're down by 3, and you got a feeling you're going to be able to get a pitch you can drive the next one. Go ahead and swing at it. You're at first base, and you think you got a chance to steal, even though it might be the third out of the inning, but we need to get a runner in the scoring position. Go for it. I don't want you going home, going to bed saying, gee, I wish I could have, should have, would have. Both managers do that with their players. And if they end up making the out, not getting done what they wanted to do, they get a pat on the shoulder, say, that's all right, we'll come back and get them next time. They both do that. But Kansas City's a small ball team, and the Orioles are a 3-homer team. I mean, and that's kind of the way they've played all season, and they play in ballparks where the clubs were made to fit into those particular yards. So it really is a contrast in clubs, and thus you get a contrast in the way they're managed.
So who do you think has the edge going in?
Honestly, I think the Orioles do, and I try not to say that because I'm here. I mean, I really think the Orioles will have an advantage, but I think this is going to be a very tough series. And who can win in the other one's yard, I think, really matters. Can KC come in here, continue to hit a couple of home runs, as they've done in the playoffs so far when they didn't do it in the season? Camden Yards is built for that. Can the Orioles go into Kansas City and pick up a couple of home runs in a ballpark that's very hard to hit homers in? In fact, it was 29th in the majors this year. Those kind of things are going to matter, and I think that kind of splits the games up. And you've got great bullpens, so it's imperative that you get a lead early in the 1 through 5 innings, really, through the first 5. If you can do that, both teams will be in great shape to finish out a ball game with a bullpen from the 6th inning on. So these games are going to be important right from the start. You better come out ready to go offensively and try and get yourself a couple of runs on the board, because it's only going to get harder as the game goes along.
Gary, you'll be broadcasting the World Series for the 12th time for MLBI TV, the worldwide broadcast. Over in the National League, 2 teams that certainly know their way around the postseason. How do you size up that Giants-Cardinals matchup?
Well, I mean, I think the Giants, their starting pitching continues to be a little bit of a question, even with the named starters that they've got. I think they're concerned about when they get to 3 or 4 if they have to go that deep in a starting rotation in the series. And their offense is kind of explosive but not consistent. Can you get away with that in the League Championship Series? I don't know. St. Louis, they defy everything. I mean, if you look at the numbers, the St. Louis Cardinals shouldn't even be in the postseason if you compare their numbers to other teams in the National League. But somehow the Cardinals find a way to win. They're able to play a complete game. If they're required to hit home runs, they find a way to do it. If they have to play small ball, they find a way to do it. They have good starting pitching that always sustains them in postseason games, and a good bullpen, especially when you get down to the setup and closer. I honestly think the Cardinals will win that, and they shouldn't, which is why I guess I think they will. They're just a team made for the postseason, and they have a mentality and experience about them that gets them over the hump in these postseason games. But it'll be a great series. And in all four of these series, you've got crowds that are electric. In different ways. You got crowds that are just going to excite the nation, I think, watching games on television, because boy, these places have great ballparks and bring fans in who really up the noise level.
And that was Gary Thorne of the MLB International TV broadcast of the ALCS. Of course, Gary's also the Baltimore Orioles broadcaster, and we'll see how the Orioles and Kansas City Royals matchup shakes out, as hopefully it'll be a lot better than the ALDS matchups that we saw both go to 3 games, but not a game further. You're listening to the Best of Downtown here for the 12th day of October 2014 here on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. I am Brian Stackpole here on a previously recorded edition of the program. We'll take another break on this show. When we come back on the other side, we'll hear from Prescott Rossi, our old friend formerly of WABI-TV, now works for WROC in Rochester, and he'll talk about the Buffalo Bills and their matchup coming on later this afternoon on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket against the New England Patriots. That and much more to come as you're listening to the Best of Downtown here on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket.
That's Football Sunday, Patriots and Buffalo Bills pregame show. 10 o'clock this morning, Gary Tangway, Andy Gresh here on 92.9 The Ticket. Kickoff a little after 1. Bob Sosi and Scott Zolak on the call. On Friday's show, we visited with Prescott Rossi. You knew him from his days at Channel 5 in Bangor. Now he works in upstate New York and covers the Buffalo Bills. We began the conversation by talking about the Bills' new ownership group.
Well, it's been quite a wild ride pretty much all year round. You had the Ralph Wilson passed in March, and then the sale of the Bills lingered all throughout the summer. Then questions on the field with E.J. Manuel's consistency. Then in comes Kyle Orton. In comes Tim and Carrie Pagula, or Carrie and Tim Pagula, excuse me. And yeah, away we go. Bills host the Patriots. New owners, new quarterback. Good vibes in Western New York, at least for now.
And we'll touch on all that as we talk with you throughout this little interview. But first, let's talk with the new ownership group, Prescott. It's now in place. They'll have the press conference later on this afternoon. However, they've been embraced so far by the Buffalo Bills faithful.
Well, I mean, the Pagulas can do no wrong in Western New York. Just, to think just even a few years ago, that a billionaire would kind of almost fall out of the sky. Nobody really knew who Tim Pagula was, or Terry Pagula was. And, this man who made all his money in oil fracking and, grew up in Western New York, went to Penn State, and he not only saves the Sabres, he also saves the Bills. They have a new stadium downtown. There are talks of a new stadium for the Bills downtown, and the Pagulas have done a lot to revitalize the downtown area of Buffalo, which is really starting to come back to life after just decades of neglect. So in Western New York, the Pagulas, they are beloved.
And I was noticing some of the merchandise sales have gone up since the announcement of the Pagulas taking over, so that's also a good sign. Speaking of the Bills and some of the expectations, how do the fans view this Bills squad moving into the 2014 season, now into Week 6?
I think mostly it was that there is a lot of talent on this team, and arguably the most talent this team has had since they last made the playoffs. And their last playoff game, of course, was the Music City Miracle against the Titans in January of 2000. You think back about how long that's been. I mean, I can't speak for you, but I was in 7th grade when that game happened. So many things have happened since then. So I think there's a thought that this team has a chance to contend for a playoff spot in the AFC. The biggest question mark, of course, being the play of quarterback E.J. Manuel. And through 2 games, he was steady, not great, but not bad. And then against San Diego and Houston in weeks 3 and 4, he really didn't show anything, and the Bills faced some on-the-field adversity. They trailed, and they really looked flat after that. And, I think there's also a little bit of the, new ownership coming in. Everybody's kind of playing for their jobs. Doug Marrone is in year 2. Doug Whaley is the GM, is in year 2. And, you don't want to have a bad showing, a bad first impression in front of the new owners. So they made the switch. And, I was on the field in Detroit on Sunday. Kyle Orton he didn't look great by any means, but he looked in command of that offense, and that's all they're looking for, a quarterback.
Now, with the switch, too, does that mean EJ Manuel's future at the quarterback position for the Bills is pretty much over, or do you still think they might try him out later on, or maybe view him as still a learning type of quarterback that they can utilize maybe next year towards the end of the season?
Yeah, and I think I would agree with that second point. I don't think that EJ is done with the Bills, especially since the Bills don't have a first-round draft pick this year because they traded it to Cleveland in the Sammy Watkins deal during the 2014 NFL draft. I don't think he's done. They still have Orton for one more year. Who knows? Maybe Orton gets hurt, something happens, and they have to turn to EJ again. But in terms of on-the-field play, I still think, it's the biggest problem the Bills have with having EJ Manuel is that they took him in the first round. So there's all that pressure and expectation for him to come in and be, maybe that Andrew Luck, kind of player, or RG3, and the Bills have also, they passed on Russell Wilson, and they passed on Nick Foles, and they passed on Colin Kaepernick. So now they're trying to make up for past mistakes, and they've just doubled down a few times now, and they've really painted themselves into a corner with EJ Manuel. He has the physical tools. He's a big guy. He's got a big arm. He has accuracy problems. He has footwork problems. He has trouble reading the defense, which seem like pretty fundamental things for a quarterback in the NFL. But, he no one questions his work rate. No one questions who he is as a person. I've talked to him a few times, and I know people who know him more than I do, and is very polite, and, he's a guy that kind of gets it, but he just hasn't been able to figure it out on the field. So I still don't think he's done. But this could be a good learning experience for him.
Former Patriot Brendan Spikes will face his former team, of course, on Sunday. What type of an impact has he made on Buffalo so far?
Well, the run defense has been terrific, and that was their biggest problem last year. They were one of the worst teams in stopping the run last season. Spikes has to fill a lot. He has to do a lot for the Bills' linebacking core. They don't, with Kiko Alonso probably out for the season. One of the best rookies on defense that we've seen in the NFL in a while. There's a lot for Spikes to do, but that front seven for Buffalo is really good. They're a top 10 defense in the NFL right now. I don't have the number exactly in front of me, but they beat up Matthew Stafford. They knocked Ryan Tannehill around for 3 hours back in week 2, and it was one of the most impressive defensive displays I've seen in a long time. Their front four is terrific. With the two Williamses, Darius, and Jerry Hughes on the edge. So I think Spikes has come into that role and done a terrific job. I mean, even Bill Belichick, who never really says nice things outside of, Ed Reed or something like that, he even said yesterday, or maybe it was Wednesday, about Spikes, he's still the same player that he was when he was with us, a very good player, just has longer hair. So, Spikes has done a very good job so far.
Prescott, Rossi from WROC in Rochester talking about the Buffalo Bills and their matchup later on this afternoon against the New England Patriots. Pre-game coverage you can hear right here on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket starting in just a couple short hours at 10 a.m. 3 hours of pregame leading up to the kickoff roughly at 1 o'clock. And then after the game, you'll hear another 3 hours of post-game coverage, again, right here on The Ticket. So roughly 9 hours or so of New England Patriots football and football surrounding talk right here on The Ticket. So looking forward to that this evening. And thanks again to Prescott for breaking down the matchup from the opposing perspective. We'll take another break on the program. When we come back on the other side, Pete Grathoff of the Kansas City Star will give us a little perspective on the ALCS from the Kansas City side. That and much more to come here on the Best of Downtown on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket.
Best of Downtown, Sunday morning, 12th day of October. Rich Kimball and Brian Stackpole with you on 92.9 The Ticket. Major League Baseball into the League Championship Series. One of the surprising teams, of course, the Kansas City Royals. Been 29 years since they've been in the postseason, having a great run so far as they square off against the Baltimore Orioles in that ALCS. On Thursday's program, we caught up with Pete Grathoff, who covers the team for the Kansas City Star, and asked him if this Royals team was a little bit antsy for the series to get started.
St. Louis, and I would say, around the Baltimore area
Yes.
as well. ESPN had a poll on its website and asked fans who they were rooting for in the American League Championship Series, and they broke it down by state. 47 states were behind the Royals. It was only Delaware, Virginia, and Maryland that were behind the Orioles, which, makes sense, but it's kind of fun to see the rest of the country getting behind the Royals. And then they had another poll when they got down to the final four teams of who you think will win the World Series. And in Missouri, the Cardinals still beat out the Royals. So the state of Missouri is still more Cardinals than Royals at this point.
For the rest of the country, getting their first exposure to seeing Ned Yost as a manager, occasionally sometimes, and some decisions that leave you scratching your head. But for the people there, they have to appreciate the work he's done getting this team into the postseason and winning these first couple of series. What are the overall impressions of Yost as Royals manager?
Well, actually, there's not a lot of love for him either. I think there might be now, but during the season, he just came under a lot of criticism. He's an old-time manager. He goes by the book for the most part, and when he's set in his ways, and he likes to let his veterans take over and put them in the spotlight, and that's kind of blown up in his face. In the division series, he did go against that, in the wild card game against the A's, he went against that, and he brought in a rookie pitcher in the sixth inning of the game, yanked Shields, and the A's ended up scoring 3 more runs, and it looked like that was going to cost them the game and end their season, and the fan outrage was pretty high. There have been a lot of times during the season where fans have just criticized him after a loss because he's pretty rigid in his thinking, at least at first, and it's cost them a game or two during the season. And on Twitter, there are even a verb started called Yosted. The Royals were Yosted tonight because they would lose the game. So I don't know that people still love him. I think some people think they might be winning in spite of him, but at this point, there's really no negative vibes toward him.
We're talking baseball with Pete Grathoff of the Kansas City Star, a guy who's really gone under the radar. I think it was perhaps the best offensive catcher in the American League this year in Salvador Perez. What does he mean to this team?
Salvador is kind of, you're right. He brings a lot to the table. First of all, he's just a phenomenal defensive player. He won the Gold Glove last year. There's a good chance he will win it again this year. And like you said, he's got a good bat. He's been a little bit slumping a little bit toward the end of the season. Yost has really used him a lot. He hasn't got a lot of rest. I think of all the players on the roster, he may benefit the most from this time off. But he is just so important. He handles the pitching staff really well. He's a valuable bat in a lineup that struggles to score runs. And then in the clubhouse, he's a card. I'll tell you, everybody loves him. He's kind of like the annoying younger brother that's around, but you can't help but laugh. And, everyone seems to take to him. And you need that, somebody who can cut the tension, and he's that guy for the Royals.
After waiting 29 years to get back to the postseason, do the fans feel like this is a team with so much young talent that might start making this a regular thing like they did back in the 70s and early 80s?
Oh, absolutely. The team's minor league system was ranked number 1 by Baseball America in 2011, and they had a number of bats that were expected to step up and do well. Eric Hosmer at first base, Salvador Perez, Mike Moustakas at third, Alex Gordon's out on left. They just could never get the pitching there, and they made a big trade before the 2013 season and acquired James Shields and Wade Davis for Will Myers from Tampa Bay. And there's a lot of bad vibes around Kansas City that they were giving up on their future, but it was exactly what they needed. They needed someone to come in who could lead the pitching staff. And now they've got some good pitchers coming up. Danny Duffy is a left-hander. He had a ERA of, I think, 2.6. Giordano Ventura, who should start game 2. He's another young guy. He's routinely at 100 miles an hour, and Brandon Finnegan was drafted this year. He's a left-hander out of TCU. They put him in the bullpen in September to see what he could do, and he has been lights out, and he's a starter. So they've got a lot of young arms coming up along the way, too, and you got to expect that maybe the bats will mature and the success they're having in the playoffs so far will carry over into the next season. And, yeah, I think people around here really believe that this is the beginning of something big.
Kansas City Royals writer Pete Grathoff talking about the ALCS matchup with the Baltimore Orioles, which got underway last Friday. You're listening to the Best of Downtown here on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. Another break approaching. When we come back, we'll talk early season Bruins action with one of the best in the business when it comes to the Boston Bruins. It's Joe Haggerty of Comcast Sportsnet coming up after the break here on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket and the Best of Downtown.
Back on the Best of Downtown, a previously recorded edition of the program, 92.9 The Ticket. Rich Kimball and Brian Stackpole here. The hockey season got underway this week for the Boston Bruins. Joe Haggerty covers the Bees for Comcast Sportsnet New England. We had a chance to get a little season preview from Joe and began the conversation by talking about the off-season moves of the Bruins, including the recent deal of Johnny Boychuk to the New York Islanders.
Well, yeah, something definitely did have to happen. The thing that is kind of damning, or the thing that I think is probably bothering a lot of people and, is making people sort of feel upset about it around the organization, fans, all around the team, is that there were scenarios where they probably could have kept Johnny Boychuk and stayed under the salary cap. It would have been difficult. It would have been a balancing act. It probably would have forced the Bruins to ice a team less than they would have liked to start the season. But, for me, I think keeping him and trying to keep him in sort of limbo under the cap would have been more of an all-in, we're going for it this year mentality. Sometimes if you're a Stanley Cup winning team or a Stanley Cup caliber team, you're going to have guys that are free agents that you can't afford to re-sign after the year is over, and you simply have to let them walk away at the end of the year because you need them for that particular year's team to strive for the Cup and to compete for the Cup. And then you know that they're probably going to be able to walk away without you getting the assets like the 2 second-round picks and the conditional third. So I think it bothers people because they know that there were ways that he probably could have stayed and they could have figured something else out. But, Peter Chiarelli has a plan. It was pretty clear he wanted to clear off a good amount of salary cap space to give himself some flexibility going forward. So he didn't have to worry about guys getting hurt, having a roster that was less than that he wanted, having to plug young and expensive players in where maybe he didn't feel like they were ready, things like that. And instead, they're going to try their best with, a guy like Matt Bartkowski probably as a top 4 defenseman, and then maybe use those draft picks they got for Johnny Boychuk to spin them off and get something at the trade deadline that's going to help them win this year. But it's disappointing, I think, when you look at the team and know that Johnny Boychuk's a guy they're not going to be able to replace with anybody else that they have there, and they lost a clutch playoff performer and a guy that played exactly the way you want in the Bruins style.
Yeah, 5 goals, 18 assists, plus 31 rating. Obviously, on the ice, it makes them a worse team in the short term, but long term, they're hoping this will give them some flexibility.
Yeah, long term, I think it does, and they don't feel quite so cap-strapped. And, if they had Boychuk, they would have been right under the salary cap, and if somebody got hurt, they would have been in a lot of trouble, and they probably would have run into some salary cap issues where, then they would have been forced to trade a player or, send a guy down or something they didn't want to do they were probably going to have to do, and things were going to have to go right for a while in order to try to make that happen. And plus the draft picks, I think, help. Certainly they can either draft players with those or use them as currency to get other players. That will help them. And getting something for a player that was going to walk at the end of the year and probably get, $5.5 to $6 million a year over a 5-year deal that the Bruins certainly weren't ever going to be able to afford. Those are all good things in the long term. And also, this clearly is a vote of confidence for a guy like Dougie Hamilton that he can be that number 3 defenseman for them this year, and I think he can. He's not going to be able to bring the physicality that Boychuk did, and he doesn't have quite the same shot that Boychuk does. And the durability with Boychuk, I think, was at times a little bit better than it is with Dougie. But, I think he's ready to really start playing 24, 25 minutes a night, and maybe in the next couple of years take that baton from Zdeno Chara as the franchise defenseman for the Bruins. But, as I said before, I think either Kevin Miller or Adam McQuaid or Matt Barkowski or Torrey Krug, somebody that is not, I don't think, ready to potentially be a top four defenseman is now going to be thrust into that role because Boychuk is gone. And for a team that has Stanley Cup aspirations, we saw how much it affects them when they lose one of their top 4D last year when Dennis Seidenberg went down. And it's not going to shock me, Rich, if all of a sudden when it gets to the trade deadline, they're talking about we need a defensive, heavy-hitting top four defenseman at the trade deadline. That's exactly what Boychuk was, and try to fill that void then.
Joe Haggerty, Comcast Sportsnet New England, with us here on Downtown. You posed the question on Twitter, and I'll ask it of you. Should we expect slow starts for Lucic and Seidenberg?
I think so. From what I've seen of Dennis Seidenberg in training camp, I think he's been slow to come back from the knee. He looks slower. He doesn't look like he's fully confident in it yet. He looks like he's losing his balance on his legs, and he's not quite at the strength level that he wants to be on his skates, which is such a huge part of what he does when, he's that German tank in the defensive zone, just knocking guys away from the net. So I definitely think it might be a slow start for him. And for Milan Lucic, I think everybody has assumed that he wasn't able to do any upper body training at all over the summer after having that left wrist surgery. He said he couldn't even do push-ups until, early September. For a guy that relies on strength and power and everything else to win battles, that's not a good sign. That's not what you want to hear. The timing, I think, is going to be off. He's probably not going to be willing to drop the gloves too much at the start of the year while he's protecting that left wrist. And you may see a little bit of a different player. It's tough to judge by the preseason because he looked like he was going through the motions, trying to protect himself from re-injury and not really getting into the fray of things at that point, and just trying to get his skate in. And that's not his game. That's not his strength. That's not who he is as a player. You would expect a much more engaged Lucic and physical Lucic once the season starts. But I think it's going to take him a little while to ramp up to that point. He's probably, of all the Bruins I'm looking at, I expect him to probably get out of the gate slowest of anybody. And, for a bellwether player like that, that's important to setting the tone for the Bruins, that's going to be a hurdle to overcome.
And that was Bruins insider Joe Haggerty of Comcast Sportsnet New England. For my money, one of the best insiders when it relates to the Boston Bruins that you can find anywhere. So thanks again for Joe for his time, and also for giving us the skinny on the early season of the 2014-15 edition of this Boston Bruins team as they look to, again, get a nice postseason run going. Maybe a chance at the Stanley Cup as well. We shall see. But again, Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket is your home for Boston Bruins action all season long, so keep your dial locked to 92.9 The Ticket. One final break on the program. We'll come back, wrap this show up in a nice little bow, and tell you what's to come for the next edition on the weekday edition of Downtown with Rich Kimball. That coming up after the break here as you're listening to Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket and the best of Downtown.
It's Best of Downtown 92.9 The Ticket. You can follow the show, by the way, on Twitter at Downtown Rich K. We're on Facebook, too, Downtown with Rich Kimball. Thanks for being with us this morning. And a reminder that we've got Patriots football coming up on The Ticket. The pregame show starts at 10 o'clock this morning, kickoff a little after 1 at Sports Radio 92.9. Tomorrow, a holiday for a lot of folks, the 3-day weekend, but we'll be working for you tomorrow afternoon. Going to be a terrific show. Very excited to have Bob Ryan back with us tomorrow. He's got a brand new book out. It's so good, Scribe, My Life in Sports, and we'll talk all about that book with Bob Ryan tomorrow afternoon. Plus, University of Maine Black Bear football coach Jack Cosgrove, Alan Adams of the Maine Edge with movie reviews, and a whole lot more. Hope the rest of your weekend goes well. Thanks to everybody on the program today. Steve Buckley of the Boston Herald, Gary Thorne, voice of the Baltimore Orioles, Pete Grathoff of the Kansas City Star, our friend Prescott Rossi, who covers the Buffalo Bills out in New York, and, of course, Joe Haggerty of Comcast Sportsnet New England. Have a great Sunday. Enjoy the Patriots game or whatever else you're doing on this holiday weekend. We'll see you with a live Downtown tomorrow at 4 o'clock on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket.